What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Templar DPS. So the Stamina Templar is, if you're looking for a class with sort of class identity, Stamina Templar is not the direction to look. With the changes that have been made to the Templar's toolset, as well as just general changes to combat, Stamina Templar, there's really only two abilities that it uses that are actually Templar abilities. The rest are pretty much sort of generic, anybody can use them abilities. That combined with the fact that Stamina Templars, generally speaking, are not going to be the strongest Stamina DPS, kind of makes them fairly unpopular in a lot of endgame PvE groups, which is not necessarily an incorrect assumption, but it's also sort of kind of looking over some of the Stamina Templar's strengths, mainly the fact that they have some increased survivability, with the fact that they can have pretty much 100% uptime on major war to major resolve, plus the fact that Stamina Templars do provide, if they choose to do so, consistent sources of Power of the Light, which improves overall group DPS. So while a lot of very high-end groups tend to shy away from Stamina Templars, they are still perfectly capable of pulling very high DPS. And of course, if all you're going for is just for clears, then a Stamina Templar will certainly get you that way. So, just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, basically everything you need to know to recreate this build yourself. We'll be going over a few other sort of sets that you might want to have on hand, depending on the specific sort of fight scenario. Then we'll talk a little bit about a couple of different skill substitutions, because as you can already tell from the front bar here, we have 3 fighter skill abilities, 2 of which are going to be essentially useless. So there are a couple of flex spots you could add in as a Stamina Templar to give yourself a little bit more group utility, which could be very helpful in progression style groups. Then of course we'll close things off with the 21 million W Parse after this short discussion of our Parse sort of rotation, just so you guys get an idea of where Stamina Templars stand in comparison to other Stamina DPS. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here with our gear. Now, Stamina Templars, generally speaking, will not benefit as much from a Maelstrom rotation as other classes will, and that's mainly because Biting Jabs is a very powerful channeled dot, so it does not actually benefit from Cruel Flurry, and it is stronger than the spammable Cruel Flurry, I should say Rapid Strikes. And so Stamina Templars are probably the only ones in the game right now, only class that are going to shy away from Maelstrom rotations, mainly because of the strength of Biting Jabs. So instead, we'll be sticking with a Monster Helm setup here. For our Monster Helm set, we're running Maarselok, which comes from one of the new dungeons, as you can expect, Lair of Maarselok. Pretty powerful set here. It deals 10,480 disease damage to enemies over 4 seconds, plus this damage can be increased by 5% for each negative effect the enemy has, up to 150% additional damage. Now, negative effect does not mean a named debuff, so yes, things like Major Fracture, Minor Fracture, all that stuff counts, but other negative effects count as well. So, for example, the poisoned, burning counts if you're, for whatever reason, you have burning glyphs. Your double Ravage Health Poisons actually count. The running slashes bleed count. Basically, a negative effect in this game basically counts as anything that you're able to track as a debuff using an add-on such as Shrendar, or using the built-in game sort of debuff tracker. So things like typical named debuffs do count, obviously, but there are obviously some other debuff things, quote-unquote debuffs, that count as negative effects because they can be tracked. So things like the double Ravage Health Poisons would count. And so Maarselok does have the potential to be very, very powerful, outstripping the next best competitor, which would be Velidreth, by a very good margin in organized groups where you have a lot of negative effects. 20 negative effects would basically double the amount of damage you can do. The downside of running Maarselok is the proc condition is bashing, so you will need to get used to bash weaving, so you will need to sort of rebind your interrupt from left mouse plus right mouse to some other sort of keybind. If you have like an MMO mouse or any of the mouse with additional buttons on the side, I typically would recommend rebinding it to one of those 2 buttons, or one of the many buttons that you might have depending on what type of mouse that you have. The other Monster Helm set that I would consider running outside of Velidreth would be Selene's. Selene's is probably the best for base game users, because it obviously comes from base game's dungeon here. It does deal a very good amount of physical damage, but unlike Maarselok and Velidreth, it is not an AoE. It is a strictly single target. So just keep that in mind if you want to pick between Selene's, Velidreth, and Maarselok. Velidreth does have some additional cleave behind it. He did update it so Velidreth does not hit one enemy more than once anymore, but the one piece is generally speaking going to be stronger than the max stamina that Selene and Maarselok provides. Weapon damage modifiers are far more numerous on stamina DPS than max stamina modifiers, and so the one piece does end up being a little bit stronger. Velidreth is also good if you just kind of want to blindly do your rotation and don't necessarily want to worry about having to bash every 7 seconds. So still a very strong set for those of you guys who kind of don't want to do any sort of bash weaving in your rotation. Next, for our body set, as you can expect, we're still running Relequen and Perfected Lokkestiiz. No other sets have really been introduced in the game to really offset either of those two sets. So Relequen is going to be our body set. Very powerful for single target DPS, but for AoE fights, we will want to swap this set out, and I'll talk about a couple of options in a little bit. Then we have Perfected Lokkestiiz. So Lokkestiiz comes from Sunspire, and Relequen comes from Cloud Rest. So Relequen armor comes from Veteran Cloud Rest +1 and up, while Lokkestiiz comes from Veteran Sunspire. On hard mode or hard mode, doesn't really matter. For our weapons, we're going with 1 axe and 1 dagger. Doesn't matter which hand that you have which weapon on. The most important thing is that the traits belong in the right hands. And then we have the Master's Bow as our back bar. So going over traits and enchants before going over some alternative sets here. The Master's Bow is going to be infused with a weapon damage enchant. Also have on hand a Maelstrom Bow infused with weapon damage enchant for those AoE fights. The Maelstrom Bow is still fairly strong, but the Master's Bow does end up beating it out in terms of single target DPS. But the Maelstrom Bow is definitely the king when it comes to AoE DPS. For our weapons, again, it doesn't really matter whether you have the axe or the dagger on the main hand. All that matters is that Nirn honed is on the main hand, and then you have sharpened on the offhand. The trait hand does matter, the actual weapon hand does not. Then we're running double Ravage Health Poisons here. For our jewelry, all weapon damage enchants and all Bloodthirsty traits. You can also go with Infused if you'd prefer. They're both fairly close together, but Bloodthirsty does edge out a little bit ahead of Infused. And obviously, if you don't have access to jewelry crafting, then you are stuck with Robust. In armor, all Divines, all max stamina enchants. Pretty straightforward here. Moving on to some other sets that you might want to have on hand for more AoE fights, or perhaps while you are farming for Relequen or Perfected Lokkestiiz that still do a very good job. Starting off with dungeon sets, there are 2 sets here that I want to talk about. First one's going to be Leviathan, which is basically the stamina version of Mother Sorrow, so it just gives you a bunch of weapon crit. This is going to be best suited, very similar to Mother Sorrow, as a body set, so you have it active on both bars. You could run it as a front bar set, just like you could run it, Mother Sorrow as a front bar set, but you would lose a little bit of DPS just because your average crit will end up fluctuating a little bit as you swap bars. The other set is going to be Thogvin's Warband, which is a very strong set when it comes to AoE pulls, mainly because of the additional physical penetration bonus on the 4-piece. Running Thogvin's does allow you to also readjust your CPs, so that way you don't need to put as many points into piercing, put them into other passives, that way you can get a little bit of additional DPS that way, though it's not all that much. One of the big benefits of running Thogvin's is that you no longer have to worry about maintaining your Barbed Trap Reminder Force because it does it for you. You will still obviously want to run Barbed Trap because as a single target damage ability, it still does a decent amount of damage. But with Thogvin's, you don't have to worry about, oh, I'm going to lose 1 or 2 seconds uptime on Barbed Trap, I'm going to lose some Reminder Force uptime. Doesn't really matter, the only thing you'd be losing would be just DPS. It's a pretty decent set there. Moving on to overland sets. Not that many, but there is one that I want to touch upon real fast, and that is going to be, once I scroll all the way up, Spriggan's Thorn, which gives you some additional physical penetration, which should help out with trash pulls if you don't have a source of major fracture. Some groups will have a Stamina Necromancer running Unnerving Boneyard for AoE major fracture. Other groups might have a Stamina Warden with Shulks who run AoE major fracture. But Spriggan's Thorn is always a safe choice because you might not necessarily get things like Crusher or Alkosh on everything as well. Next, a sort of very good set to pick up if you want to start farming for different sets is going to be Briarheart. So this comes from Hrothgar. Very decent set here. It is a proc set, so you can wear this as the front bar set. If you'd like, it will carry over to your back bar. So it just gives you a nice boost in weapon damage as well as a nice heal while the weapon damage bonus is in effect. So pretty decent set here. Very good if to use if you're just starting to get started into vet trials and you're just starting to farm for things like Relequen and Lokkestiiz. In terms of trial sets, there are a handful of trial sets that I also want to touch upon. Twice-Fanged Serpent, also known as Two-Fanged Snake, comes from Sanctum Ophidia. This pretty much fits the same sort of niche as Spriggan's Thorns. Basically, use it in trash fights to get some additional penetration or to kill things faster. Not very useful in boss fights. Next is going to be War Machine. This pairs very nicely with Stamina Templars because we'll be using Crescent Sweep as our ultimate, which only costs 72 ultimate, making it the second cheapest ultimate in the game, just behind Incapacitating Strike on a Stamina Nightblade. So a really strong set here. It gives you and 2 other people Major Slayer for 10 seconds, which, if you do the math, gives you about a 40 to 45% uptime on Major Slayer. So not quite as good as Lokkestiiz, but it does allow your other 2 DPS to wear other sets, so that way they can get Major Slayer. This comes from the Halls of Fabrication trial from Vardenfell. Next, I want to talk about Vicious Serpent, which comes from all 3 Cragglorn trials. This is probably going to be one of the better sets in the game for those of you guys who do not have access to DLCs or expansions. It's the only source of Minor Slayer in the base game set for Stamina DPS, plus it also reduces the cost of Stamina abilities and has a ton of armor bonuses. So overall, a pretty decent set here. It's really good for sort of VMA and 4-man content and trash pulls because of the additional stamina you get back. But if you do have things like DLCs and expansions, Vicious Serpent is sort of a stepping stone into getting those better sets, Relequen and Lokkestiiz. So that's pretty much it for the gear stuff. Going on to our character sheet. And my Dark Elf. Dark Elves are going to be one of the better racial options when it comes to stamina DPS. They get 1875 max stamina and 258 additional weapon damage. The absolute best would be Orcs. They get 2000 max stamina and 258 additional weapon damage on top of 1000 max health to give you a little bit more padding when it comes to survivability. Could also go with what I like to call the sustain races. As the name implies, they have racial passives that really focus more on sustain. These are going to be the Imperials, the Templars, the Imperials, the Red Guards, and the Wood Elves. All 3 of those get 2000 max stamina, and then they have different sources of sustain. So Wood Elves get 258 stamina regen, Red Guards get 990 max stamina back whenever they deal damage every few seconds. Imperials get 3% cost reduction across all abilities, and they get 333 health, magic, and stamina back, along with 2000 max health to kind of give them a little bit more survivability. Their DPS ceiling will be lower for those 3 races compared to the initial 2, just because you don't have the additional weapon damage bonus. And then if you kind of want to fit sort of a jack-of-all-trades build, perhaps this is going to be your main character, and you want to flip-flop between Magicka, Stamina, DPS, and perhaps support roles, you could also run Khajiits, which get 825 Magicka health and stamina back. They get 85 Magicka and stamina regen, 100 health regen, and they get 10% additional critical healing done and critical damage done. So it kind of fits a little bit into everything there with Khajiits. You're not going to be breaking any world records with them, but they do kind of fit this very nice sort of jack-of-all-trades build. For attributes, all of our points are going into stamina here. In terms of overall sustain for stamina DPS, it has improved a little bit here, mainly because we are going to be using Soul Trap, which uses Magicka. Now, if you are using Maarselok, that sort of cancels out that benefit because of the obvious bash weaving. But generally speaking, you should be able to sustain blue food. If you're having trouble sustaining a light attack rotation using blue food, you can swap out to something like Artam Thickway Broth or Dubious Khorne Throne for additional sustain. So, depending on whether you're using blue food or sustained food, you might need to shift some points into health. So if you're running something like Clockwork Citrus Fillet or Dubious Khorne Throne and you are not an Orc or an Imperial, you may need to shift some points into health, or you can shift one of your enchants from a stamina enchant into a health enchant to make up for the health. You want to hit around 16.5 to 17k max health before Ebon, before toughness for vet trials. For Mundus, we're going with the Shadow. Nothing has changed there. And then for food, just for purposes of comparing different classes and getting an accurate comparison between them, we will be using Lavafoot, which gives you max stamina and stamina regen. In actuality, you'd be using something like Bystat Food, Dubious Khorne Throne, or Artam Thickway Broth, depending on how well you're able to sustain. Going over our skills next, our front bar is going to be Biting Jabs, Rending Slashes, and then you have 2 flex spots. I fill them with Expert Hunter and Silver Shards. There's also Barbed Trap, which you should have, and then Empowering Sweep. On the back bar, we have Soul Trap, Poison Injection, Arrow Barrage, Barbed Trap again, Restoring Focus for the Stamina Sustain, and Empowering Sweep. Now, these two abilities are really just here to kind of fill out our bar. They give us 3% additional weapon damage for each one that we have slotted due to the fighter skill's passive, but you can swap these out as needed. So, for example, you need a heal, run Resolving Vigor. You need to do a little bit of group protection, Circle of Protection, or Ring of Preservation. You need to provide additional synergies, use Blazing Spear. So you have a lot of options here. If you want to even run a shield, we could just run Radiant Ward if you'd like. It's better than nothing, and it's probably, you're the only stamina class that has some sort of shielding ability that's actually halfway decent on stamina DPS. So you have a lot of flexibility with these two slots here. Like, for example, a stamina Templar that we have in Mayflower sometimes uses Ritual Retribution for the Purify synergy and the heal, which actually is fairly decent if you take a look at it. So, not that bad. You do have some flexibility here when it comes to, very least, your front bar setup. Next, our champion points. CP cap has not changed. It's still 810, which gives us 270 CPs across each of our different constellation colors. Starting off with green CPs. The only thing that really you need to hit here is going to be 100 into Mooncalf to maximize your overall sustain. Everything else is sort of up to you. So for example, I have 75 in Tenacity, but if you don't find yourself heavy attacking at all, then you obviously don't need these points in Tenacity, you can shift them elsewhere. Then I have 31 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, and 33 Warlord. For our blue CPs, this is assuming that you are running 1 Sharpened, you might be running 2 Sharpened, or you might be running Sogwins. So this is assuming that you're running this exact build. So do keep in mind that if you have more penetration from other sources, you will need to shift points around piercing. So for example, you're running Sogwins, take some points out of piercing so that way you meet the pen cap without over penetrating. So I have 49 to Mighty, 61 piercing, 56 precise strikes, 56 thaumaturge, and 48 into Master at Arms. And then our red CPs is going to be a very balanced approach, sort of good mitigation across all pieces of content here. 81 Ironclad, 61 Thickskin, and 64 into both Hardy and Elemental Defender. That's pretty much it for all the build information. Now let's go ahead and talk about the rotation itself. It is fairly straightforward, mainly because if you think about it, you don't have that many abilities. You have 2 on the front bar, you have 5 on the back bar, so you're really cutting out essentially a lot of abilities here. Generally speaking though, you're pretty much going to be doing back bar dots. Make sure to maintain channel focus, or not channel focus, restoring focus for the stamina sustain. Basically use your ultimate whenever it's up, doesn't really matter what bar you use it on. And the same thing with trap, just as soon as it's up, just pick whichever bar that you're on and use it. Beyond that, it's just jabbing and jabbing away. You'll be able to use restoring focus about every other time you're on your back bar. And that's pretty much the entire rotation itself. Again, very straightforward just due to the fact that we don't have that many abilities to keep track of. It's basically Endless Hail, Poison Injection, Soul Trap, Rearming Trap, Running Slashes, and Biting Jab. So a total of 6 abilities. And if you need to, you can drop Restoring Focus, depending on how well you feel your sustain is going. In this particular Parse, when we do 200 million Demi Parse, you'll find that sustain is really easy, mainly because we're using Parse food to kind of equalize all the Parses. But if you're running bi-stat food, obviously you want to try to maintain that restoring focus for the additional stamina sustain. So really simple, really straightforward. Kind of the general lack of sort of class abilities sort of lends to that very stale feel here. So we're going to go ahead and get started here with our 21 million dummy Parse. And again, this is just here so we can get an accurate comparison between the various classes in the game. Basically gives us all of our buffs across that maintains all of the buffs the same across all the classes here. This is going to be slightly inflated just due to the fact that we are getting 100% major force uptime, which is obviously impossible in an actual raid environment unless you have 6 or 7 Roarhorns going. So this is going to be slightly inflated, but again, this Parse is mainly to give you guys a kind of looks into how much DPS you should be able to potentially get, as well as kind of give you a point of comparison across the various stamina classes builds that I have compiled. So let's go ahead and get started here with our Parse. So remember to activate your synergies on your front bar here because we are running Maarselok. Lokkestiiz on the front bar. Now keep in mind that fighting jabs is a channel. So using Maarselok in the middle of biting jabs will completely cancel out that animation. As you can see there, I just did that to kind of show you guys a little bit of what happens if you decide to use Maarselok in the middle of a jab animation. So you can use Maarselok really whenever you'd like. There are various add-ons for those of you guys on PC to track Maarselok. Oops. I used Expert Hunter instead of my ability. I would definitely try to avoid tying the Maarselok proc with biting jabs. I like to tie it in with my rending slashes if I can. Basically bash cancel out of rending slashes. Oh, that was a little bit of weird lag spike issue there. Oops. Don't do what I just did and use your synergy on your back bar. And execute, your rotation is not going to change at all. Templars don't have an execute. This Parse is a little bit worse than my previous one. Yeah, it's a little bit worse than my previous one, but I do have some older Parses saved up, so you guys get an idea of how much DPS you're actually able to pull. A little bit of weirdness there, some of my abilities weren't going off. Still a little bit of lag input here. So you can see here we pulled about 81.8k or so. The previous Parse that I did was 83.1k, and I did another one that was 82.7k. So closer to about 83k was what you can expect, at the very least from me. Not a very good stamina Templar myself. Plus a little bit of lag here and there kind of fluctuates the overall sort of Parse here. Did miss one major Slayers, which kind of lended a little bit to the lowering, as well as the lag, just so my abilities weren't going off properly here. So potentially I could do a little bit better if I had a better connection to the PTS from this location. But you can see here, Maarselok is actually going to be a little bit underrated here in solo parses because you don't have a support role to give you things like minor vulnerability, major fracture, major breach, minor breach, all of which count towards increasing Maarselok's DPS. So realistically, Maarselok is going to be probably closer to around here-ish, probably closer to about 4K, 4.5K DPS in an actual raid environment. One thing I do want to point out here is that this is with the exact same build with Deadly Cloak as one of our flex spots. This gives me some additional survivability through the use of major evasion. So it is possible to use something like Deadly Cloak. Just a little bit of warning, Deadly Cloak does proc every second, so it does get a little bit jarring on the ears if you decide to use Deadly Cloak as one of your front bar abilities. But that is it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions about the build itself, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Again, hope you guys found this informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.